Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. Tonight's story is The Goblin at the Grocer's by Hans Christian Andersen. There was a proper student. He lived in the attic and owned nothing. There was a proper grocer. He lived on the ground floor and owned the whole house. And the goblin kept well in with him, because every Christmas Eve he was given a dish of porridge with a big lump of butter in it. The grocer could afford it, and the goblin stayed in the shop and found it very rewarding. One evening the student came in by the back door to buy himself some candles and cheese. Having no one to send, he had come himself. He got what he asked for and paid for it, and he got a nod and a good evening from the grocer and the grocer's wife. This was a woman who could do more than nod. In fact, she had the gift of the gab. The student nodded back, and then stood still, busily reading the sheet of paper that had been wrapped around the cheese. It was a page torn from an old book which should never have been torn up, an old book full of poetry. "There's some more of that," said the grocer. "I gave an old woman some coffee for it. If you like to give me a copper or two, the rest is yours." "Thanks," said the student. "I'll have it instead of the cheese. I can eat plain bread and butter." "It would be a great shame if the whole of this book got torn up. You are a fine fellow and a good businessman, but you know as much about poetry as that bin." Now that was a rude thing to say, especially about the bin. But the grocer laughed and the student laughed, for of course it was said sort of jokingly. But the goblin was shocked that anybody could dare to say things like that to a grocer, and one who was a landlord and sold the best butter. When night fell and the shop was shut and everybody in bed except for the student, the goblin went in and took the woman's gab. She didn't use it when she was asleep. And whatever object in the room he put it on to at once found its tongue, and was able to express its thoughts and feelings just like the woman, though only one could have it on at once, which was just as well, for otherwise they wouldn't have been able to hear one another speak. And the goblin put the gab on the bin where the old newspapers were kept. "It is a fact," he asked, "that you don't know what poetry is." "Is it a fact," he asked, "that you don't know what poetry is?" "Why, of course I know," said the bin. "It's the sort of stuff that's at the tail end of the papers and gets cut out. I fancy I've got more of it in me than the student, and I'm only a little bin compared to the grocer." And the goblin put the gab on the coffee grinder. Dear me, how it wagged! And he put it on the butter cask and on the till. Every one of them had the same opinion as the bin, and what the majority are agreed upon you have to respect. "Now for the student," said the goblin, and he crept quietly up the back stairs to the attic, where the student lived. A light was burning there, and the goblin peeped through the keyhole, and saw the student reading the tattered book from downstairs. But how bright it was in there! From the book came a ray of light which grew into the stem of a great tree that raised itself aloft and spread its branches over the student's head. Every leaf was so very fresh, and every flower the head of a lovely girl, some with dark and sparkling eyes, and others with eyes that were blue and wonderfully clear. Every fruit was a shining star, and the air was full of marvelous music and singing. No, the little goblin had never dreamt of splendor such as this, let alone seen or heard it. And he stood there on tiptoe, peeping and peeping, till the light went out. The student must have blown out his lamp and gone to bed, but the little goblin stayed where he was, for the music played on softly and sweetly, making a delightful lullaby for the student as he lay down to rest. "This is wonderful," said the little goblin. "I never expected this. I think I'll stay with the student." But thinking it over, and being sensible, he said with a sigh, "The student hasn't any porridge." And so he went. Yes, he went downstairs again to the grocer. And a good thing it was that he did, because the bin had used up nearly all the woman's gab in telling, on one side, what a lot he had in him, and he was just going to tell it all again on the other side when the goblin came and gave the gab back to the woman. But from then on the whole shop, from the till to the firewood, took its opinions from the bin. And so great was their respect for it and their belief in that whatever the grocer read out the art and theater reviews from the paper, the evening one, they used to think it all came from the bin. But the little goblin no longer sat listening quietly to all the wisdom and common sense downstairs. As soon as the light shone out from the attic, the rays seemed to pull him like strong anchor cables upstairs, and he would have to go and peep through the keyhole. And then there would come surging towards him a grandeur like that which we feel in the rolling ocean when God passed over it in a storm, and he would burst into tears. Why he cried he had no idea, but they would be tears of unhappiness. How very wonderful it would be to sit with the student under that tree. But it couldn't be, though he was glad of the keyhole. He went on standing there in the cold passage, even when the autumn wind blew down from the trap-door in the loft, and it was so very, very cold. But the little fellow never felt it, not till the light in the attic was put out, and the music had died down in the wind. Then, he would shiver and creep downstairs again to his warm corner, where it was so snug and cozy. And then, when Christmas came, with its big lump of butter in the porridge, why, then the grocer was favorite. Now, in the middle of the night, the goblin was awakened by a terrible banging on the shutters. Somebody was banging away on them outside, while the watchman was blowing his whistle. There was a big fire, and the whole street was aglow with it. Was it in this house, or was it in the neighbor's? Where? It was terrifying. The grocer's wife was in such a state that she took her gold earrings off and put them into her pocket, so as to save at least something. The grocer ran to get his bonds, and the servant her silk mantilla. She could afford one. Everybody was bent on saving his treasures, and so was the little goblin. In a couple of bounds he was upstairs and in the attic, where the student stood at the open window, calmly watching the fire, which was in the opposite house. Seizing the wonderful book on the table, the little goblin stuffed it in his red cap and held on to it with both hands. The best treasure in the house had been saved. Then off he dashed, up onto the roof and right up on the chimney, where, lit up by the glow from the burning house opposite, he sat down, holding on to his red cap and the treasure inside it with both hands. Now he did know where his heart lay, and to whom he really belonged. But when the fire had been put out, and he thought the matter over, well, then he said, "I'll divide my time between them. I can't drop the grocer altogether, because of the porridge." And that was perfectly human of him. We, too, go to the grocer for the porridge. The Goblin at the Grocer's by Hans Christian Andersen. Thank you so much for listening. Good night, everybody.